Chapter 10 of The Wrong Box. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Wrong Box by Robert Louis Stevenson and Lloyd Osborne. Chapter 10. Gideon Forsyth and the Broadwood Grand. The reader has perhaps read that remarkable work, Who Put Back the Clock, by E.H.B., which appeared for several days upon the railway bookstalls, and then vanished entirely from the face of the earth. Whether, eating, time makes the chief of his diet out of old editions, whether Providence has passed a special enactment on behalf of authors, or whether these last have taken the law into their own hand, bound themselves into a dark conspiracy with a password, which I would die rather than reveal, and night after night sally forth under some vigorous leader, such as Mr. James Payn or Mr. Walter Besant, on their task of secret spoliation, certain it is, at least, that the old editions pass, giving way to new. To the proof, it is believed that there are now only 3 copies extant of Who Put Back the Clock, one in the British Museum, successfully concealed by a wrong entry in the catalogue, another in one of the cellars (the cellar is where the music accumulates) of the Advocates' Library at Edinburgh, and a third, bound in morocco, in the possession of Gideon Forsyth. To account for the very different fate ending this third exemplar, the readiest theory is to suppose that Gideon admired the tale. How to explain that admiration might appear, to those who have perused the work, more difficult, but the weakness of a parent is extreme, and Gideon, and not his uncle, whose initials he had humorously borrowed, was the author of Who Put Back the Clock. He had never acknowledged it, or only to some intimate friends while it was still in proof. After its appearance and alarming failure, the modesty of the novelist had become more pressing, and the secret was now likely to be better kept than that of the authorship of Waverley. A copy of the work, for the date of my tale is already yesterday, still figured in dusty solitude in the bookstall at Waterloo, and Gideon, as he passed with his ticket for Hampton Court, smiled contemptuously at the creature of his thoughts. What an idle ambition was the author's! How far beneath him was the practice of that childish art! With his hand closing on his first brief, he felt himself a man at last, and the muse who presides over the police romance, a lady presumably of French extraction, fled his neighbourhood, and returned to join the dance round the springs of Helicon among her Grecian sisters. Robust, practical reflection still cheered the young barrister upon his journey. Again and again he selected the little country house, in its islet of great oaks, which he was to make his future home. Like a prudent householder, he projected improvements as he passed. To one he added a stable, to another a tennis court, a third he supplied with a becoming rustic boat house. How little a while ago, he could not but reflect, I was a careless young dog with no thought but to be comfortable. I cared for nothing but boating and detective novels. I would have passed an old-fashioned country house with a large kitchen garden, stabling, boat house, and spacious offices, without so much as a look, and certainly would have made no inquiry as to the drains. How a man ripens with the years! The intelligent reader will perceive the ravages of Miss Hazeltine. Gideon had carried Julia straight to Mr. Bloomfield's house, and that gentleman, being led to understand that she was the victim of oppression, had noisily espoused her cause. He worked himself into a fine breathing heat, in which, to a man of his temperament, action became needful. "I do not know which is the worst," he cried, "the fraudulent old villain or the unmanly young cub. I will write to the Pall Mall and expose them. Nonsense, sir, they must be exposed. It is a public duty. Did you not tell me the fellow was a Tory? Oh, the uncle is a radical lecturer, is he? No doubt the uncle has been grossly wronged. But, of course, as you say, that makes a change. It becomes scarce so much a public duty." And he sought and instantly found a fresh outlet for his alacrity. Miss Hazeltine, he now perceived, must be kept out of the way. His houseboat was lying ready. He had returned but a day or two before from his usual cruise. There was no place like a houseboat for concealment, and that very morning, in the teeth of the easterly gale, Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield and Miss Julia Hazeltine had started forth on their untimely voyage. Gideon pled in vain to be allowed to join the party. "No, Gid," said his uncle, "you will be watched. You must keep away from us." Nor had the barrister ventured to contest this strange illusion, for he feared, if he rubbed off any of the romance, that Mr. Bloomfield might weary of the whole affair. And his discretion was rewarded, for the Squire-Radical, laying a heavy hand upon his nephew's shoulder, had added these notable expressions: "I see what you're after, Gid; but if you're going to get the girl, you have to work, sir." These pleasing sounds had cheered the barrister all day, as he sat reading in chambers. They continued to form the ground base of his manly musings as he was whirled to Hampton Court. Even when he landed at the station, and began to pull himself together for his delicate interview, the voice of Uncle Ned and the eyes of Julia were not forgotten. But now it began to rain surprises. In all Hampton Court there was no Colonel Villa, no Count Tarnow, and no Count. This was strange, but viewed in the light of the incoherency of his instructions, not perhaps inexplicable. Mr. Dickson had been lunching, and he might have made some fatal oversight in the address. What was the thoroughly prompt, manly, and businesslike step? Thought Gideon. And he answered himself at once. A telegram, very laconic. Speedily the wires were flashing the following very important missive: Dickson, Langham Hotel. Villain and persons both unknown here. Suppose erroneous address. Follow self next train. Forsyth. And at the Langham Hotel, sure enough, with a brow expressive of dispatch and intellectual effort, Gideon descended not long after from a smoking hansom. I do not suppose that Gideon will ever forget the Langham Hotel. No Count Tarnow was one thing, no John Dickson and no Ezra Thomas quite another. How, why, and what next danced in his bewildered brain. From every centre of what we playfully call the human intellect, incongruous messages were telegraphed. And before the hubbub of dismay had quite subsided, the barrister found himself driving furiously for his chambers.
There was at least a cave of refuge.
It was at least a place to think in, and he climbed the stair, put his key in the lock, and opened the door, with some approach to hope. It was all dark within, for the night had some time fallen, but Gideon knew his room. He knew where the matches stood on the end of the chimney piece, and he advanced boldly, and in so doing dashed himself against a heavy body, where, slightly altering the expressions of the song, no heavy body should have been. There had been nothing there when Gideon went out. He had locked the door behind him. He had found it locked on his return. No one could have entered. The furniture could not have changed its own position, and yet, undeniably, there was a something there. He thrust out his hands in the darkness. Yes, there was something. Something large, something smooth, something cold. "Heaven forgive me," said Gideon. "It feels like a piano." And the next moment he remembered the vestas in his waistcoat pocket, and had struck a light. It was indeed a piano that met his doubtful gaze, a vast and costly instrument, stained with the rains of the afternoon, and defaced with recent scratches. The light of the vesta was reflected from the varnished sides, like a staice in quiet water, and in the further end of the room the shadow of that strange visitor loomed bulkily and wavered on the wall. Gideon let the match burn to his fingers, and the darkness closed once more on his bewilderment. Then, with trembling hands, he lit the lamp and drew near. Near or far, there was no doubt of the fact. The thing was a piano. There, where by all the laws of God and man it was impossible that it should be, there the thing impudently stood. Gideon threw open the keyboard and struck a chord. Not a sound disturbed the quiet of the room. "Is there anything wrong with me?" he thought, with a pang, and drawing in a seat, obstinately persisted in his attempts to ravish